So this is the first PMQs in the wake of the Russian report finally being released. Finally, after so many months, almost a year. I expected, you know what, I honestly don't know. Let's just have a bit that I recorded from my phone.
It concludes that Russia poses an immediate and urgent threat to our national security and is engaged in a range of activities that include espionage, interfering in democratic processes and serious crime. The Prime Minister received that report 10 months ago. Given that the threat is described as immediate and urgent, why on earth did the Prime Minister sit on that report for so long?
Well, Mr. Speaker, actually, when I was Foreign Secretary, for the period that I've been in office, we've been taking the strongest possible action against Russian wrongdoing, orchestrating, I seem to remember, the expulsion of 130 Russian diplomats, 153 Russian diplomats around the world, while the right honourable gentleman opposite sat on his hands and said nothing, while the Labour Party parroted the line of the Kremlin when people in this country were poisoned at the orders of Vladimir Putin.
Before Starmer puts in, I want to give my thoughts on that. Boris didn't answer the question. The question was, you've sat on this report that is incredibly damning, saying that Russia has an unbelievable influence in British politics. You've sat on this report for 10 months. Why? Boris came out with, well, when I was Foreign Secretary, I did a thing. Not mentioning that when he was Foreign Secretary, he got a British citizen thrown in an Iranian prison, then doubled down on his lie, which means Nazim Radcliffe is still in the Iranian prison because of this dipshit. Goes on to say, and of course doesn't mention that British intelligence agencies flagged him up as a massive security risk because of all the money he gets from Russian backers. Instead, he uses the poison attack. Well, Starmer was very vocal during that time. Corbyn was not repeating the lines of the Kremlin. Corbyn was saying, we've been in pointless wars, let's actually do an investigation. And then let's act on what the investigation says. Now, everyone's knee-jerk reaction was, it's Russia. And that's what the investigation later proved. What did we do? We kicked out a few diplomats, and we still allowed them to involve themselves in British politics. Alright, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I stood up and condemned what happened in Salisbury, and the Prime Minister, I supported the then Prime Minister on record. So I'd asked the Prime Minister to check the record and withdraw that. I was very, very clear. The report was very clear that until recently the government's badly underestimated the Russian threat and the response it required. It's still playing catch-up. The government's taken its eye off the ball. Arguably, it wasn't even on the pitch. After this government's been in power for 10 years, how does the Prime Minister explain that?
To recap, the question, after 10 years of the Conservatives being in power, they're not paying attention to outside interference into UK politics.
Mr. Speaker, I think the right honourable gentleman's questions are absolutely absurd. There is no country in the Western world that is more vigilant in protecting the interests of this country or the international community from Russian interference. And in fact, we are going further now, introducing new legislation to protect critical national infrastructure and to protect our intellectual property. And I think he will find, if he goes to any international body or any gathering around the world, that is the UK that leads the world in caution about Russian interference. And I must say, I don't wish to contradict.
Stop right there. We know Russia interfered with the Brexit referendum. We know that Theresa May stopped the investigation into that. We know that Russia interfered with the US elections and by proxy interfered with British elections, and the Conservative governments stopped the investigation. into the interference into British elections. So right there, Boris has just lied again.
The right honourable gentleman, but he sat on his hands. He said nothing. The leader of the opposition parroted the line of the Kremlin that the UK should supply. I didn't hear him criticise the then leader of the opposition. If he criticised the then leader of the opposition, then now is the time for him to set the record straight.
I get that this is his stick. This is his appeal. It's his marketing campaign to make him more relatable, despite the fact that he's as unrelatable as it can get. He's a sociopath. But he didn't say a thing, but he said a thing. But if he said a thing, but he didn't say a thing, but is it? You are meant to be the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. You are meant to be a fucking adult with a serious job. Act it.
Mr. Speaker, I was absolutely clear in condemning what happened in Salisbury, not least because I was involved in bringing proceedings against Russia on behalf of the Litvinenko family. That is why I was so strong about it. And Mr. Speaker, I spent 5 years as Director of Public Prosecutions working on live operations with the Security and Intelligence Services, so I'm not going to take lectures from the Prime Minister about national security. The Prime Minister says he's going to bring forward...
I think somebody wants to go for a cup of tea. We don't want an early bath. Kirsten.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says he will bring forward new legislation. I want to make it clear to the Prime Minister...
This is something that really annoys me in Parliament, and it's so much worse when it's bigger, because I constantly watch Parliament. I watch these debates. I watch it when it's a big crowd. I watch it when it's a small crowd, because I do genuinely care about politics. I care about this country. This is something I expect to see in a primary school. I look after adults with severe learning disabilities. They don't act as childish and as petulant as these elected representatives. How hard is it to be an adult?
We will support that legislation and work with the government. It's not before time. 18 months ago, the Prime Minister says the government's vigilant. 18 months ago, the Home Secretary said we don't have all the powers yet to tackle the Russian threat. And he said the Official Secrets Act are completely out of date. Other legislation's been passed in that 18-month period. This is about national security. Why has the government delayed so long in bringing forward this legislation?
Mr. Speaker, this government is bringing forward legislation, not only a new Espionage Act, not only new laws to protect against theft of our intellectual property.
Again, pay attention to the question. A member of the government said we haven't got the power. A high-ranking member of the government said we haven't got power to bring forward legislation 18 months ago. Why has it taken so long, considering all the other legislations you brought in? Like a couple of days ago, you just decided Parliament has no say on any trade deals. Why has it taken so long?
But also a Magnitsky Act directly to counter individuals in Russia or elsewhere who transgress human rights. And there's been no doubt what this is really all about, Mr. Speaker. This is about pressure from the Islingtonian Remainers who have seized on this report to try to give the impression that Russian interference was somehow responsible for Brexit, Mr. Speaker. That's what this is all about. The people of this country didn't vote to leave the EU because of pressure from Russia or Russian interference. They voted because they wanted to take back control of our money, of our trade policy, of our laws. And the simple fact is that after campaigning for Remain, after wanting to overturn the people's referendum day in, day out, all the period when he was sitting on the Labour front bench, he simply can't bring himself to accept that.
Can I just gently say to the Prime Minister, as I did last time, he may have to go to Specsavers. The chair is this way, not that way. If he can address me, it will be a lot better. Kirsten.
Control over trade, as I just said. Parliament have just voted, the last few days voted, to have no say in trade agreements whatsoever. The American deal, we have very few details about it, but what we do know for absolute certain is that the public is not allowed to know anything about it until 5 years after it's been implemented. That's really taking back control, isn't it, Boris? Why is he bringing up Brexit? Starmer has said nothing about Brexit since becoming Prime Minister. Not just today, but since becoming Prime Minister. The Brexit campaign was an illegal campaign. That is what our British intelligence agencies stated. They were stopped from investigating and pursuing criminal charges by Theresa May. It was an illegal campaign, but no one has said about overturning it. What they've said is that people deserve an actual voice. You might have voted for Brexit. You might have voted to leave the European Union. Did you vote for Boris's version, where we have absolutely no say in trade deals, absolutely nothing to do with the EU, absolutely nothing to do with aerospace programs, with scientific research, with European intelligence agencies? Was that what you voted for? Because if you did, you're getting exactly what you wanted. An isolationist Britain that is bent over the barrel and begging America to, at the very least, use lube. But Starmer didn't say anything about Brexit. But this is Boris's ploy. This is what he did in the election in December 2019. Oh, Corbyn doesn't know anything about Brexit. What's his stance on Brexit? There's Brexit. He doesn't want Brexit, but he wants Brexit. What's his stance on Brexit? Stance was very clear. You deserve to say in what happens to the country you live in. When this is done, you should get a say. That was very, very clear. And Boris is going back to his pre-scripted lines, because it resonates with the people who won't bother to do any research, who have already planted their feet firmly in the Boris camp, regardless of how disgusting of a human being he is, regardless of how much of an incompetent, buffoonish politician he is, and regardless of the damage that he is doing economically, physically, and integrity to the UK.
Mr. Speaker, I see the Prime Minister's already on his pre-prepared lines. Yeah. This is a serious question of national security. The Prime Minister sat on this report for 10 months and failed to plug a gap in our law on national security for a year and a half. Mr. Speaker, one of the starkest conclusions in the report is that the UK is clearly a target for Russian disinformation campaigns. The report also highlights that this is being met with a fragmented response across Whitehall and across the government. The report refers to this as a hot potato, with no one organisation recognising itself as having the overall lead. That's a serious gap in our defences. This is not about powers, it's about responsibility, Prime Minister. So how is the Prime Minister going to address that gap and make sure the UK meets this threat with the joined-up, robust response it deserves?
Mr. Speaker, there is no other government in the world that takes some more robust steps to protect our democracy, to protect our critical national infrastructure.
Again, the question is, the intelligence report, the Russian report, states very clearly the intelligence agencies don't want to take this. No one is being given authority over it. No one is being told, look, this is now your department, you take care of it. The hot potato means everyone's trying to pass it around them because there's so many people involved, MI6, MI5, and the other one. They can all pass the buck because someone else is involved. Someone needs to be named and put in charge of this. And 10 years, it's not been done. 18 months, it's not been done. For the 10 months that Boris has had this report, it has not been done. For the 10 months that British intelligence agencies flagged up Boris Johnson as a massive security risk because of his ties to Russia, the Prime Minister has not done a goddamn thing to protect this country. His response
and to protect our intellectual property, as I have said, from interference by Russia or by anyone else. And frankly, I think that everybody understands that these criticisms are motivated by a desire to undermine the referendum.
Just stop right there. When Boris became Prime Minister the first time round, he quickly gave away billions of British taxpayers' money that we had in an EU trust, EU bank trust. So that's not protecting British intellectual property, because we didn't get anything from it. It's not like it went to pay off our bill. It's not like it went towards, I don't know, something that we could benefit from later on. He just gave it away. It's not my money, fuck it. Gone. And again, he's had this report for 10 months. He has done absolutely nothing. They've interfered. When I say they, I mean Russia. Russia have interfered in every election since the referendum, at least, and the referendum itself, by using fake accounts, fake bots, and spreading lies about various party candidates, various party members, and lies about the EU itself. We have done nothing. But this is sort of like when Theresa May stood up and said, no one has ever funded schools quite like the way that the Conservatives have done it. Literally had schools across the country protesting because their funding had been cut so much that they couldn't stay open for 5 full days. And then her government cut funding twice. Boris's response
on the European Union, that membership of the European Union that took place in 2016, the result of which he simply cannot bring himself to accept.
A serious gap in our Official Secrets Act, laying bare for 18 months, and that's all the Prime Minister has to say about it. One way the government can seek to clamp down on Russian influence is to prevent the spread of Kremlin-backed disinformation. Obviously, social media companies have a big role to play, but the report also highlights serious distortions in the coverage provided by Russian state-owned international broadcasters such as Russia Today. The High Court has ruled that Russia Today broadcasts pose actual and potential harm. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's time to look again at the licensing for Russia Today to operate in the UK?
Mr. Speaker, I think this would come more credibly from the Leader of the Opposition had he called out the former Leader of the Opposition when he took money for appearing on Russia Today.
Before Boris's response to that, I do want to point out Russia Today is a difficult one, and I think, yeah, they should be looked at with their licensing again, because while you do have a much more critical view of the UK, again, because the amount of money that Boris takes from Russian backers and people with close ties to the Kremlin, they're not necessarily as tough on Boris as they would be Starmer, for example, or Corbyn if he had been in, and things of this nature. And while people from the left do go on there, it is easy to spread misinformation and package it up as op-eds or even just outright lies. I mean, we can see it because we can look at places like Fox News. But it's not to say that everything that comes out of RT is wrong. It's not to say that everything that comes out of RT is deliberately misleading people, because sometimes it is true. But yeah, I think people should, the government should look at licensing on RT.
I mean, Mr. Speaker, he protested neither against the former Leader of the Opposition stance on Salisbury, nor against his willingness to take money from Russia Today. He flip-flops from day to day, Mr. Speaker. One day he's in favour of staying in the EU. The next day he's willing to accept Brexit. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has more flip-flops than Bournemouth Beach.
Flip-flops, Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the party opposite bravely abstained on a vote that attempted to tie us into the EU indefinitely, further highlighting the increasing detachment of Labour from the old heartlands like Rother Valley. Can my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, confirm that we...
So Starmer is allowed to come back, and I'll skip ahead to that. But again, Jeremy Corbyn is not leader of the Labour Party. Keir Starmer is. To my knowledge, Keir Starmer has not been on RT. To my knowledge, no one in the front bench has been on RT, at least not this year. So are we now going to call out Boris Johnson because some of his party members like Matt Hancock went on BBC, which is an insane company because their entertainment section is so left-wing it is insulting. But then you get the news, BBC Politics, which goes to bat for right-wing monsters like Boris Johnson and condemns Jeremy Corbyn. Remember, Corbyn's a terrorist. Corbyn sides with terrorism. Corbyn's a bad man. Why? Well, he went to Northern Ireland and he tried to stop the conflict between the UK and the IRA. Let's ignore the fact that Theresa May, David Cameron and Boris Johnson have given a lot of money to the Saudi government, who literally fund groups like ISIS and Boko Haram. But again, didn't answer the question. He didn't answer the question. The question was, with all this misinformation that's coming out on places like RT, do you think it's worth looking into it again? Didn't answer. Now I'm going to assume he didn't answer because he's bought and paid for by Russia. He's a little puppet bitch and it benefits him. I mean, realistically, that's all it is. Like, Boris Johnson doesn't care if you pay him. If it doesn't benefit him, he won't do it. But this is directly benefiting him. And he's not going to throw a spanner in the works. He's incredibly lazy, doesn't do his homework, doesn't do his fucking job. But when he directly sees, no, this benefits me, he won't go against it.
On this side of the House, we remain fully committed to delivering our promises to the British people and to restoring our full economic independence on the 1st of January, so the people of Thurcroft, Maltby, Diddington and across Rother Valley get the Brexit bonanza and level up that we so deserve.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly can give my honourable friend that assurance. That's what the people voted for.
Side note, I wasn't going to comment on this dipshit, but I'm going to now. The extension does not lock us in. The extension says, okay, well, let's imagine whatever job you're doing now. You are going to quit on the Friday. You're going to quit on the Friday, and come Monday, you're going to a much better job. So you are definitely going to quit on the Friday because you've got that job that's going to pay twice as much with benefits on the Monday. You haven't actually got the job yet, but you're still going to quit on Friday. You haven't got the job on Monday yet. You don't know who the job's with. You don't know who the employer's with. You don't really know what the benefits are, but you're still going to quit on Friday. Yet you don't have to quit on Friday. You can keep working with the company you're working with, and when you finally have that golden promised job, then you can quit. That's the scenario that we're in. That's the extension. We can leave at any time during the extension. We can leave right now. We can leave today on the extension. But we're not ready. We have done practically nothing except give billions upon billions of taxpayer money to private companies that have bought and paid for Conservative politicians.
And that's what we will deliver.
Bring Keir Starmer back for one more question. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, pre-prepared gags on flip-flops. This is the former columnist who wrote 2 versions of every article ever published. Mr. Speaker, in case the Prime Minister hasn't noticed, the Labour Party is under new management. And no front bencher of this party has appeared on Russia Today since I've been leading this party. finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Prime Minister about the appalling persecution of the Uyghur Muslims in China. We've all seen the footage of the Uyghurs being herded onto trains and heard the heartbreaking stories of forced sterilisation, murder and imprisonment. We support the Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister and the government in their strong and clear condemnation of China for this in recent weeks. What further steps will the Prime Minister take? And in particular, will he consider targeted sanctions against those responsible? And will he lead a concerted diplomatic action with our international partners to make clear that this simply cannot be allowed to stand in the 21st century?
Mr. Speaker, that's why the Foreign Secretary only this week condemned the treatment of the Uyghurs, and that's why this government, for the first time, has brought in targeted sanctions against those who abuse human rights in the form of the Magnitsky Act. And I'm delighted he now supports the government. But last week, of course, he didn't support.
This is a good question for Boris, because this isn't questioning anything that he's done. This is supporting the government's position on what's going on in China. It's a good question, and his response, given that Boris wrote 2 incredibly contradictory papers just on Brexit, is a brilliant way of coming back. Keir's performance, I think this has been his worst one so far. I think this has been his worst one. Because he just, to me, he just doesn't seem to be highlighting the fact that the Prime Minister hasn't answered a single question.
The government, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad he's with us this week. I don't know how many more questions he's got, Mr. Speaker, since you allow him to come back and ask throughout this session. We've been getting on consistently with delivering on our agenda. A year ago, Mr. Speaker, this was a leader.
Just a side note. Saudi Arabia abuses human rights all the time. Iran has a British citizen, which, by the way, the European Union wanted to make it fully fucking clear. If anyone takes an EU citizen, they give them back or the EU's going to come knocking. Brexit Party stood against that. It's important to point that out. But there are a lot of groups that the Conservatives support who do violate human rights. But start somewhere, credit where credit's due.
The opposition who was supporting an anti-Semitism condoning Labour, a government that wanted to repeal Brexit. I represent a government that was getting on with delivering on the people's priorities. 40 new hospitals, Mr. Speaker, 20,000 more police, 50,000 more nurses, and by the way, we've already recruited 12,000 more nurses and 6,000 more doctors and 4,000 more police. We are delivering on the people's priorities. We are the people's government. And by the way, we're the government that supports the workers of this country as well, with the biggest ever increase in the living wage.
We're heading up to Scotland to visit the SNP.
12,000 more nurses were already nurses who were studying, who got screwed over because they were studying and they were told, look, if you quit your job and you come to work for us during this pandemic, you'll be paid a wage. They got fucked. 40 new hospitals. We've lost at least 3 since December. And again, this was an easy question for Boris. This was an easy question for Boris because this wasn't challenging Boris. This wasn't challenging the Conservatives. This was saying you're finally doing a good fucking thing. And still, the egotistical psychopath, sociopath, fuckknuckle has to turn it into an insult against Labour. Doesn't answer the goddamn fucking question. I have a question for every single Boris supporter out there. Why? Just why?